Welcome back to another episode here on the Inkwell Lounge. I'm Chris, aka Questing for Lore, and in this week's episode, I'm going to do something a little different. Normally, I have people on here and I talk to them about themselves. I do interviews with members of the Disney Lorcana community, but I've also done some episodes in the past where I've talked about the stuff that I was taking to the DLC, the gear that I was taking for recording interviews and everything. I've talked about the stuff that I have here at my desk, just to kind of give y'all a little bit of information about, what I use and the gear that I use. Well, this time I want to take even more of a step back. I've had a couple of people that have asked me over time what my process is. I am 80 some odd interviews in on this channel with various members of the community, and there's kind of a structure to the madness. I have developed kind of this process that I follow now for preparing for the community interviews, for actually, doing them, talking to the person, and then kind of the follow-up as well. So I wanted to get into that a little bit and just kind of share some of that process with you. And, hopefully, maybe, if you do this kind of thing in the future, you can kind of apply some of this and, adapt your process to it. So one of the things that I do before the interviews that I have is do a lot of research. So I know this sounds kind of time consuming, but honestly, it is one of the things that I feel like sets me up for success on these interviews the most. So basically what I do is I go out, I find their social media, I find, any kind of competitions they've been in, any competitive events, what decks they've played, and just kind of get a feel for who they are. A lot of times it's not just about the narrow slice of their life that is Lorcana. Sometimes there's other things that are interesting to bring in. Maybe it's not their first time creating content. Maybe it's not, this is not their first TCG. There's always interesting things to find out about people. And some of that stuff is great to have preloaded. If you've been on my show before, you know that I will send a pre-interview outline. So that's one of the things that I like to do for my guests, to be able to have them understand what's going to be asked, what we're going to talk about. Now, granted, because of the level of research that I do before these episodes, not everything that's in that interview are things that we actually talk about. There's usually, more often than not actually, there's usually quite a few topics that we don't actually get to, which, honestly, in my opinion is fine. Because the goal of my channel when I talk to people and I have these community interviews is to just have a conversation with them. I want to get to know them. I want my listeners to get to know them the way that I know them now, or at least a little bit on a superficial level based on my research and everything. So, you do this research, you find these little interesting tidbits, and, you want to make sure that you can ask those smart questions. So it's not just, hey, what about Lorcana? What do you like about the game? Generic things like that. You can actually talk about the deck that they played at the DLC in Dortmund or Indianapolis if they're over here in the US. So there's all sorts of little interesting tidbits that you can bring in and have those things throughout the interview and have the output do along the way, which is super handy, especially for somebody like me who has to have a little bit of structure. There are some people that can just kind of go off the cuff and just kind of talk about whatever. I need a little bit of, a little bit of structure to it. So, And so what I do is I will prepare that interview, or prepare that outline, I guess, and kind of highlight certain areas. If I'm talking to a content creator, I know that I'm going to, talk about content creation. There's just kind of some stuff, some basic questions that are built into that, and then that lets me see where it's going to go from there. If I'm talking to a competitive player, I talk about the current meta. I talk about, how they did at a certain DLC or a certain CCQ. You just kind of build up this certain kind of pattern depending on who you're talking to and what you want to talk about. So the benefit of sending that over to the person, I usually do it at least a day or two before so they can kind of read through it, is that they can start thinking through answers to these questions. And it's not always questions. A lot of times it's just like statements about, facts about like their content and about their background and everything. Just talking points basically. So I will send that over to them so they can kind of get an idea for it. And I always ask 2 questions just to make sure. I say, is there anything I left out that you want to particularly mention? And is there anything that's in there that you don't want to talk about? I've been fortunate to where a lot of the people that I've talked to, there's been, at least more often than not, there hasn't been any problems with the topics that I've sent over. There have been a couple of people that were like, yeah, I'd rather not talk about that if that's okay. I don't feel like I want to talk through that right now. And that is completely okay, right? Because the point here is to make the person feel comfortable, is to make them, be able to open up and have a good conversation. And if there's topics in there that they don't want to cover, we don't have to cover them. I am not in the business of like pushing and being edgy and trying to make sure that people are, really revealing, these secrets or anything. I want them to feel comfortable. I want to have a good conversation, and I want to have them leave, at the end of the episode feeling like it was just like a good time. And I think, more often than not, it seems like that's the case. I've had a lot of people that, at the end of the episode, they're like, yeah, this was super fun. It was great. I loved it. And I think some of that is from the preparation, right? To be able to have that information at hand, to be able to have it, right here, basically on my screen so that I can reference it. And a lot of the times it's not always in the order that I put it in the outline. You kind of have to be flexible. You have to kind of go with the flow, basically. And, and sometimes you get out of order and sometimes you talk about the same things. And honestly, that's okay, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people don't think about or don't realize when it comes to, especially just content creation in general. It doesn't have to be perfect when you make it. You can be as hard on yourself as you want to be and say, oh, that was not a great video. That was kind of terrible. But more often than not, if you go ahead and put it out there, unless it's just, a disaster and you have bad recordings and the audio is terrible and, there's all sorts of other problems that can happen. Unless some of those things happen, more often than not, there's going to be somebody out there that identifies with that content. They're going to look at it, they're going to listen, they're going to watch it, and it's going to kind of resonate with them. And I know my stuff is not the usual Lorcana content, right? More often than not, a lot of the Lorcana content out there is talking about, decks and competitive decks and, the things that more competitive players want to see, because it is, it's a game. It's right. You want to be competitive with it. But I wanted to take a little bit of a different focus with my content. I wanted people to get to know the people in the community. And so focusing in on that was kind of one of like the mission statements for my channel, is basically wanting to show the community other people in the community. I know it doesn't sound like profound or anything, but it gives me a little bit of a focus on things. I've talked to competitive players, I've talked about the meta, I've talked about all that kind of stuff before, where we get a little bit more technical. We talk more about certain cards and, what was super effective at a certain DLC outside of their own deck. But more often than not, I just want to get to know them as a person, which is one of the things that I really enjoy about it. So as far as the actual interview, so I'll usually set it up a little bit ahead of time. I've actually started using Riverside. I'm not sure, I imagine a lot of people have heard of it by now. But I used to do just OBS with a site called Video Ninja that JDZ Quest kind of turned me on to. That was great as long as your internet connection holds out. And mine can be spotty at best. So one of the nice things about Riverside is that it actually will upload the video, the high quality video of each of the participants up to their servers as it's being recorded. So it's not like Zoom or it's not like some of the other tools where it's going out to the server and coming back to you. It is because, you get to see that real-time interaction. But Riverside will actually upload the video so that when it comes time to actually download it and do the editing and everything, it's high quality video from both sides, regardless of if my internet connection decides to flake out in the middle of it, which I have had happen, unfortunately. If mine, flakes out, then it's only my video that's impacted. So it does make it nice, and it does make it super handy. So anyway, I usually kind of start off and I try to get a feel for, I start with their origin story basically every time, because I feel like that's one of the things that you can really get to kind of the root of why they're into Lorcana, how they found it and everything that kind of like sets the stage a little bit. So you have that foundation to build on, right? Because, obviously the channel is about Lorcana, so you kind of have that built in. But to be able to have that foundation of, here's where I found it, here's why I really get involved with it, and, here's where it has kind of taken me from there. Depending on who I'm talking to, sometimes that's, hey, I decided I wanted to go to the competitive side, and I'm going to play on that side. And sometimes it's just, content creators. And it's, them deciding that they wanted to share their love for Lorcana with, with the rest of the world. So, and then from there, it basically, kind of turns into just like a conversation, right? Like I said, I have the outline, I have the basic topics, and some of that is just very free form, and some of those topics can kind of bleed into each other. You might be talking about content creation, and then they start talking about, a deck that they spotlighted in their content. And so then you kind of morph into some of the, the competitive side of things. So it's very much kind of a flow to it versus, question and answer. I'm going to ask you a question. What's your answer? Because I find that it's definitely an easier listen, and it's not quite as rigid when you're not doing the question and answer. You kind of anticipate what they're going to say, you look ahead a few minutes, and you think, okay, now they're talking about this. I have a topic that, I've already told them about that's kind of related to that, so let's jump to that topic. And it makes it easier to keep the conversation going and keep it fluid and everything. One of the other things that is really important is making sure that you, as the host or the person that's doing the interview, is not afraid of silence. So there's a lot of times it's really easy to, whenever the person that you're interviewing is talking, you just kind of want to interject and, say your mind or, speak your mind or whatever. But a lot of times that kind of breaks the flow, right? And sometimes you will have a guest and you'll be asking them a question or talking about a topic. And they'll say a little bit, then they'll pause, and then they'll start talking again after they start thinking. You have to be okay with that silence, and it takes practice. It really does. I catch myself all the time saying, yeah, and it's really difficult. It's a really difficult habit to break, honestly. You have to be okay with the person that you're interviewing talking and not feeling like you have to interject or, remind people that you're still there or anything. You have to be okay with silence. And whenever they finish a thought, you don't want to be there immediately with something, right? Whenever they finish a thought, you want to kind of pause and then start talking. And it kind of helps with that natural flow of the conversation. So it's not like you were sitting there thinking about, even though you were thinking about what the next topic might be, it's not like you were sitting there and just waiting to jump in. So it gives a little breathing room, and it makes it, it makes it really easy for them. If they want to keep going, there's not that talking over each other. And it definitely does minimize that as well. So that's one of the things that can really be difficult, especially for people that are listening on the audio only side. If people are talking over each other, then it kind of gets muddled and you kind of lose the momentum a little bit. So as much as possible, you want to make sure that one person is talking at a time. It's okay if people react to it. If you have, more than just yourself, if you have multiple people doing an interview or doing a podcast, if you have multiple people, it's okay for them to, all laugh together or all react to something that, that was said. But you definitely don't want to interrupt a thought unless it's going to be something that, adds to the atmosphere and to the conversation. So another thing to think about when you're talking to other people is trying to make sure that you give them an opportunity to talk more, right? I've talked to a bunch of people in the past that they're worried that they're going to talk too much. And honestly, I reassure them, this is an open conversation. This is usually kind of what we shoot for, about an hour-ish, a little bit over sometimes. But that's on you as the host to try to figure out how to kind of steer the conversation so that when it starts getting to that point, you can kind of, wrap it up a little bit. But in the, in the middle of it, you want the guest to be able to talk as freely as possible and to be able to share their stories. And so being able to kind of have those tell me more moments, you can kind of lead them into other stories and into other parts of the conversation just by saying, hey, you just talked about this. Let's talk a little bit more about it or something like that, to kind of really, really get them into the conversation and really keep them going. And if you open that door, then a lot of times they'll follow it. They'll take the opportunity. They'll go into a little bit more depth about something that you just talked about. And what's really fun for me, at least personally, is listening to these people talk, the people I interview, and as they're talking, finding something interesting about what they're saying. And it's not necessarily always the main point that they're making. Sometimes it's more about oh, you mentioned this one thing. Maybe you're talking about a competitive deck that they played, and they mentioned that they played it at the DLC in Richmond. So then later on, when it comes time to talk about competitive play and everything, you can say, oh yeah, you said that you were at Richmond. How was that experience? How did you do? There's all sorts of topics that you can then branch out on and kind of take the time and really get to know the full picture of it versus I went to Richmond. It's more about I went to Richmond and then they get to tell the rest of the story, which, honestly, that's where I find out a lot of the really interesting information, trying to keep it light, but not superficial. It's kind of a fine line to follow, and one of the things that also really helps is listening to what they're saying, and whenever they're done is actually kind of summarizing it a little bit, so that they feel like they're actually being heard. It's not just me asking questions, it's not just, hey, we've got a list of topics to talk about. It's more about me listening to what they're saying and kind of reflecting back and saying, so, yeah, I heard that, Dogs was terrible at Indianapolis. So I understand it was a bad matchup for you, and kind of not repeat what they're saying, but summarize it a little bit and kind of bring it back to some of my own perspective as well. Because there's stuff that I find out about, daily, basically, in the Disney Lorcana community that can potentially apply back to these conversations, which is really cool, because it's not just, let's just talk about the person. It's also, let's talk about the game and the community as well, and kind of where those things meet up in the middle. So it is really easy to get into the habit of asking kind of leading questions that, what was it like, or, that kind of thing. That's okay to ask sometimes, but you don't want to always go with the leading questions and try to specifically tease these things out. So I will say one thing. I have done 81, 82 interviews with people, and I have talked to all sorts. There are some people that are very much talkers. You get them started on a subject, and they will just talk for, 30 minutes if you let them. And so you as a host or you as the interviewer kind of have to figure out how to kind of steer that a little bit, so that it's not just, running out of control, stream of consciousness. I do that, honestly. I will do a lot of stream of consciousness kind of things because I'll think about something during the interview and it'll just kind of pop up and I'm like, hey, let's talk through it. But you have to be careful that that doesn't get out of control too much. And so that's definitely one of the skills that as an interviewer you have to kind of practice. Is steering that conversation without being overbearing about it is one thing. You don't want to hit those points and just like cut the person off and say, okay, so now let's talk about, I do that from time to time. But it is something that I'm definitely trying to work on because I don't like doing that. I don't like shutting down a line of conversation. I like as much as possible to try to kind of meld the conversations into each other and have a good flow between them. But sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes you just want to talk to somebody about something and there's just not a good transition. And so sometimes you have to say, all right, and there's that little piece of something that you kind of vaguely make the connection between the two topics. But you never want to just like shut it down and say, okay, so now let's talk about this. And I am totally guilty of that as well. So, it's something, like I said, something I've been trying to work on and something I've been, trying to get better about in more recent episodes. So, but you want to make sure you're kind of controlling the pacing of the conversation. You kind of get a feel for whenever a certain thread of conversation has started to kind of, fade out a little bit. And so, you can kind of get a feel for that as you're talking, and you develop that over time, honestly. A lot of times, like when I first started doing these interviews over 2 years ago, it took a lot of doing. It took some practice at it to be able to get to the point where I felt comfortable with kind of making those transitions and talking to people and shifting subjects and trying to make those connections. And so you want to make it kind of like a natural bridge between the topics as much as possible and make sure that you're not dwelling on one subject too much. Now, there are a lot of people that I've talked to in the past that their main thing was content creation, right? But it's funny that some of them, like after we get done talking about that, we'll shift over to competitive play or something. And, you can see their face light up because they're really excited about getting better on the competitive side. And, they either didn't mention that or, it wasn't apparent from, the outward actions of them. And so it's really cool to kind of discover those topics as we go along to be where you find out about the background of somebody and you find out about, what the real motivations are, because it's not always obvious, right? You look at somebody who's doing content or who's a competitive player and they may be trying to get into, if they're a competitive player, they may be trying to get into content creation. Maybe they're trying to, get guides going on Metafy and it's not getting a whole lot of traction. And so, but they want to talk about it because it's something exciting for them. And so finding those topics that are really exciting for the guest, I think goes a long way towards making sure that the energy of the episode kind of keeps flowing and kind of keeps moving and the conversation stays a little bit more fresh. So, I did mention some of the technical issues before with Riverside and OBS and everything. One of the things that you really have to practice at is trying to deal with when there are technical issues. So there's always going to be problems, right? Not every interview can go perfectly well and perfectly smoothly. I just talked to the Glimmer Gallery, and whenever we were talking, my internet connection decided to flake out. And so hers was fine. So her video was still recording and mine kind of chopped up a little bit. But the really tricky part is whenever everything is back, to try to kind of restart that conversation, to get the motivation back, the momentum back as you're talking to the person. And a lot of times what I find myself doing is kind of thinking about what we were talking about before things started getting a little wonky, and then basically saying, okay, we're going to do a reset, and then we have a pause, and then we kind of start back into the conversation. Sometimes it feels a little awkward, but a lot of times, if you kind of get back into that interviewer persona and, just kind of start back into the conversation, it actually works pretty well. And so then you can kind of keep moving on. That's kind of a small thing that I had, like a little hiccup that I've had in the past. I've actually had times when my power went out while I was doing an interview, and so that was like super awkward. There was also another time that I think I was talking to Color's Law, and I actually didn't hit the record button for the first 30 minutes that we were talking. And so we had to go back and redo the first part of the conversation all over again. And sometimes you just have to kind of go with the flow on that stuff. It happens, especially when you're doing podcast interviews, over the internet, and you're not actually able to do stuff in person. That's kind of the other thing, the other piece of it. If you've seen the stuff that I've done at DLCs in the past, I love just talking to people, right? And so I will take my gear with me, and I will just stop somebody at a DLC and just have a quick interview with them. Even if it's just like, 3 to 5 minutes. It's really cool to get those perspectives as it's happening, right out there on the floor and everything. It's definitely a different feel than the sit-down kind of more formal interviews that I usually do here on the channel. But it's fun, it's fun to kind of flex different muscles and be able to do that kind of stuff so that you keep it fresh. You get a feel for what it means to do kind of either side, and then potentially you can bring in practices from one side to the other. There's been times where I talk to people at DLCs that I've known them or I've talked to them on the channel in the past, but there's also ones that I've talked to that I haven't talked to on the channel in the past. And so what I'll actually do is kind of come up with like a little brief of, hey, I've seen this person, maybe it's on Twitter and they say they're going to, to Indianapolis. So I unfortunately didn't get to go to Indianapolis, but you see on their profile that they're headed to a certain DLC, and you say, oh, okay, I want to talk to that person. I want to try to find them. And so actually writing up just like a little summary, a little brief of who they are, what their content is, what it's like, how it kind of fits in with the overall content creator perspective and, or competitive side, what DLCs have they been to lately? Just do that research, like I mentioned at the beginning, but not necessarily as in-depth, because you're not spending an hour talking to them. You're spending, 3 to 5 minutes or maybe even a little bit longer so that you can kind of get a little bit of perspective, a little bit of background on them so that when you ask those questions, you can kind of have a little bit of context about who they are. So it definitely helps. It's not for everybody. It's how I run. I can't do it without a little bit of context around the person. So I will usually have the entire episode. I have a habit of ending with similar questions for everybody. Sometimes it's a little bit different depending on what the episode is, but usually it's like, favorite ink and card, favorite Disney movie, where they go to their LJSs, and then where their content is, because a lot of times I'm talking to content creators. So, but it's interesting to me to end with those questions because everybody that plays Lorcana kind of has the ink that they like, right? And it's at a certain time, right? It may be that, when I interview them, they love Amethyst, but then later down the line, they're like, oh, Sapphire is the way to go. I love this deck. Sometimes it depends on the meta and everything. But it's really an interesting insight to which ink that they prefer, right? Because they all have different identities. They have different kind of flows to them, the decks and everything. And then the favorite card. So I always tell them, you can say the favorite card that you like to play or the favorite card art that you like. And it's always interesting to me to see what people pick. a lot of times it's the one that they like to play because, it's in a deck that they're playing right now. Maybe Set Champs is coming up. But they want to talk about that particular card and how much they love it in their deck. And then there's some people that they talk about, previous enchanteds, or they talk about, a card from the first chapter that really means something special to them. And getting that kind of story out, from just saying, what's your favorite card? That kind of stuff is really interesting to me, to get that perspective and to kind of get a little bit more detail, like behind the scenes, behind the, the player kind of thing of why they like that stuff. The Disney movie one is always really interesting. So, basically everybody is Disney fans that I talk to. It's kind of built in with the game. A lot of people, they were attracted to the game because it was Disney related. And so it makes an obvious question, right? But it is really interesting to see the answer to these, or to that question, and to get kind of that perspective on people. Sometimes it's like, yeah, I love The Lion King because that was something that I grew up watching. I basically wore out the VHS tape, playing it, rewinding, playing, rewinding, over and over again. But then you have some people that, they're like, I really identified with the characters in this movie. It was a really kind of, critical part of when I was growing up, and I felt like, I just identified with them, and like, hey, I see myself in that character, which is always really cool to me because, you get that perspective that it's not just, oh, I really like a Disney movie. It's more of, I like this Disney movie because, I identify with the characters. It happened at a very pivotal, point in my life. Or even some of the people that I've talked to that are, a little bit older and have kids and everything, to be, to be the parent that says, I love this movie because my kids love this movie, and we watch it as much as possible. And so it's really cool to get the kind of that background and a little bit more perspective outside of just the, just the Lorcana perspective of their personality. So, and then LGS shoutouts is always fun because, you get to find out where they like to go. A lot of times they'll kind of describe the scene at the LGS. And so, they'll get a little bit of perspective on, hey, I love going here because it's a little bit more casual. A lot of the people I talk to are in larger cities, and so they have lots of options. But there are some that I have talked to that they have one, which is kind of like us here. I've got one that's here in town, roughly. And then the next closest one is about 2.5 hours away. So, I can't get to it on a regular basis, obviously. And so I'm kind of here, and I have my main store here. It's Lotus Games for anybody that's in the Kalispell, Montana area. Definitely be sure and check it out. League is on Saturday afternoons. But, it's always interesting to hear people describe their LGS. And a lot of times they'll describe, the people that run it or the people that come to the league. And, and more often than not, it's not necessarily just, hey, I go to this one, it's super competitive, I love it, it's, it's like hardcore, that's the best thing. I'll get a couple of those, right? But a lot of times, and I think this is a testament to the community that Lorcana kind of brings to the table, no pun intended, it's a testament to that community that a lot of people are like, I love going to League. It's basically hanging out with friends. Yeah, we get to play the game and we get to, practice for Set Champs or, tweak our decks and everything. But a lot of times it's just, I like going and I like hanging out with people, which is really honestly what this game is a lot about. Yes, there's a competitive aspect to it, but without a good community around it and a good solid foundation like that, you're not going to have the competitive players. You're not going to have the competitive events because there's not going to be any kind of community around it. So it's really cool to me to kind of get a perspective on which ones people like and why they like it and everything. So, and then usually I'll wrap it up saying thank you and kind of finishing out the episode, kind of making sure that I lead the conversation that way. There's been a couple of times that I've been talking to people and we kind of, we'll get to the kind of those end questions and then it sparks another conversation, which is always cool to me, right? Because I love having these conversations with people, and to be able to just have it like organically happen like that is always better to me. I don't mind if it goes a little bit over. That's fine. I think the longest episode I've had has been like an hour and a half-ish. So it's not like there's not a little bit of a buffer there. If you're shooting for about an hour and you go to an hour and a half, not terrible. So, but it's always really cool when those late conversations start up and, we get talking about just kind of a random topic. It's not always something that was planned before on the outline or anything, which is really fun to me. It's just that extra little insight into the person that I'm talking to. So usually what I'll do after the fact is, I'll stop the recording. We'll talk a little bit about, what the follow-up looks like, what I need from them, say absolute thank yous and everything. And usually I'll follow up with some kind of like a message and just saying, hey, I really enjoyed talking. It was great to get to know you, because like I said, it's about getting to know them. It's not about specifically the game itself. Which I think is kind of different from a lot of the other content out there. So, but then whenever the episode is uploaded, because I make like custom thumbnails for them, and then I'll do the podcast version of it as well. Whenever everything is posted and live, I'll send them a link and I'll say, hey, it's live. Thank you so much again. Especially whenever it's somebody that, like, we had scheduling issues. I've had some people in the past where, like, we schedule it for one day and for some reason it doesn't work because life happens, right? Either on my side or on their side. And so we always try to be a little bit flexible about the timing on it. And, and I'm pretty open. I mean, I have kids, but they're older. And so my schedule's pretty flexible. I'm pretty open, basically any day, unless there's, school stuff going on or something. And so it makes it a whole lot easier to schedule people when I can say, any day after 3 p.m. Mountain Time or something. And so that gives them the opportunity to have a little bit more flexibility. And so a lot of times they'll give, 2 or 3 days that they can talk, and a couple of times. I'm also fortunate to work from home, and so if I need to take lunch to do one of my interviews, I can always do that too. And so it makes it easier to kind of schedule these things. And there's a lot of people that work in the evenings, and so the evenings don't work, and so they want to do in the mornings, which is great. It's just fine. And then you have people that I've interviewed a couple of people over in the UK and Europe. And so you have to set it up, so that it's not middle of the night, their time. And, they can be a little bit more fresh and, have a good conversation and not be exhausted the next morning. So, kind of taking that kind of thing into consideration. So, and then one of the things I also like to do as a follow-up on my side is kind of go back through the conversation. A lot of times I'll look at the transcript and kind of try to summarize things a little bit. And anything that was interesting about the guest, I kind of pulled that out, and I have basically, little profiles that I have on people. Not in like a creepy way, trust me, it's just all about Lorcana. But, to be able to have interesting little tidbits that we already talked about in the episode, so that, if down the line, if I ever want to talk to that person again and have them on, or as a part of a group, I can potentially make those parallels between people and say, oh, you two had a similar experience at the DLC in Richmond, and then we can kind of kick off a conversation about that. So it helps to have a little bit of background, a little bit of, extra information going into future episodes. And sometimes it's not even just when I talk to that person again. Sometimes it's just about whenever I talk to somebody else and they have a similar experience, and I can say, oh yeah, I talked to, so-and-so about that same thing. And here's kind of the perspective they had on it and the background that they provided on it. And so it provides a little bit extra bridge between, more community members. And, so it's not just this isolated interview of, I'm going to talk to you and only you, you're just this primary focus. It's more of like, how does this person fit into the wider community? And so you get a little bit of an extra perspective on that and kind of weave that into the conversation. So basically, that's kind of the main flow of it. After that, after I post the video, you kind of keep track of things. Fortunately, with Riverside, it actually will create the little social media posts for me. I can turn on the captions and everything. And so it makes it easier to take those and immediately post them to Instagram and TikTok and Twitter, X, whatever it's called these days. So I can just get the word out there, and then I'll post to those platforms. I'll go and post on, over on all the different Discords that I'm in. There's lots of Discords that have a content creators channel that you can actually post your content to. And so I'll go out there and I'll post it, and just kind of get it out there as much as possible and really spread the word that the episode's gone out. I'll retweet it, and some people will retweet it from the Inkwell Lounge account, which really helps, spread it out a little bit more. I find that because of the kind of content that I make, it is a little bit more of the soft skill kind of content. It tends to gain more traction a little bit more on the Instagram and TikTok side, and so we'll get a lot of views that come over from that, just because it's a little bit more of like the community focus. I find that Twitter is a little bit more on the competitive side. So I'll get some traction over there. There's a lot of community folks that are there, but it seems like a lot of the majority of them are more on TikTok and Instagram. And so I'm making sure that I'm getting out over there and sharing it on those platforms as well. So, but yeah, that's basically the summary of it. I know it sounds like a lot to do for each episode, but I feel like it brings, quality to the overall episode. It's not like we're rehashing the same 2 or 3 topics over and over again. There's always plenty to talk about, and there's always tons of things to cover, especially if they've been in the community or in the content creation space for a while. So there's even been some people that I finished the conversation at about an hour-ish and have said basically, I want to do a part 2. Like in my mind, I'm like, okay, I want to have this person on again. And often it's not even about the same topic, right? So Lore Gaines, I had him on for just like a creator interview whenever I first talked to him. And then more recently, he topped the Citrus Clash. And so we had a conversation about that, and we talked a little bit about, hey, what's changed since we last talked? So you kind of have those built-in topics, which is kind of cool to be able to kind of circle back and, really talk about those things again and try to get a perspective on how they've grown as a player, how they've grown as a content creator. There's lots of different things when you talk to somebody for the second time, or multiple times. I've had, I think it's 2 or 3 people that I've had on multiple episodes now between, like Andy from Rules of Villainy. I had them on the Rules of Villainy podcast on for a creator interview. And then I've had Andy specifically on twice after that for some limited content. Same thing with Heath, the Mad Drafter. He's been on a couple of times as well, but it's been more about like the first one was him as a creator and then the limited content after that. So it's always interesting to kind of find those people and find those particular experiences and bring their perspective in on that. Like if we just had DLC Indianapolis, and I'm lining up people to talk to next week for, that were participants in that event and that did well in that event, and to kind of get their perspective on it. So it's a little bit more timely than just, hey, I want to talk to you as a content creator, in just kind of this generic kind of sense. it kind of sets that timeline, which I think is kind of cool, and then you move through time and you can kind of go back and watch these episodes and remember, oh yeah, that was about the time that, DLC Richmond or DLC Indy was happening. And, it's always really cool to kind of go back and look through history. That's the other thing, I mentioned earlier on, just getting stuff out there and don't feeling like it has to be perfect from the get-go. Going back and looking at some of the initial interviews that I did, besides the technical kind of things where the camera that I used was not great and the audio was not super great because it was just like the built-in microphone on my laptop, to see the evolution of the content over time and really go back and try to look at this content, look at your own content, and try to figure out, okay, I've seen this grow over time, where can I improve? And I think that's one of the biggest things that you can do as a content creator, especially really honestly any kind of content, whether you're interviewing people or whether you are creating competitive content, is trying to figure out how you can keep improving over time. Things that you can change, technology you can upgrade, different techniques that you can follow. I know there's been quite a few channels out there that have done like sub-series inside of their channel. It's not just always the same main focus inside of it. And so, it's really cool, and it really provides this kind of creative space for you to make this content that's all yours and to be able to really get your voice out there. And and it's fun. There's a reason I've been doing it for, over 2 years now. Like I said, part of it is just that I like talking to people. But it's also interesting to me to grow as a creator and try to improve all those skills as time goes on. So, but yeah, I hope this was interesting. I know it was a little bit longer probably than I meant it to be, but like I said, I do tend to ramble sometimes. So. But yeah, if you like this episode, you can also go and look back at some of the other ones that I have that are a little bit more like behind the scenes kind of things with the gear that I took the DLC. I forget if it was Richmond or I forget which one it was. But the gear that I took for my on-the-spot interviews, and then there's another that I talked about what's here at my desk. So I'll make sure and link those in the show notes. But yeah, I'm really interested to hear if you found this episode interesting, useful. If there's any questions you have about the process that I follow, or anything interesting that you heard in here that you would like to find out more about, feel free to leave it in the comments down there. I will definitely keep an eye out for it. But yeah, if you like this show, make sure to like, subscribe, and rate it on your platform of choice. If you'd like to reach out to the show, you can leave a comment below, or you can hit us up on Inkwell Lounge on all the socials, or you can go to inkwelllounge.com and get links to everything, including a way to contact me directly. So, all right. Well, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.